So, my name's Hazel Reid. I'm from Canterbury Christchurch University, and this is my colleague Anne Chant. And what we're going to talk about this evening is what it says on the tin. We're involved at the moment in two European projects, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we think practitioners need to know. So one of the things that we hope in the discussion part of the season is that we can also draw on your knowledge and expertise. So we've got from now until 6:30, we won't go over time, and we will build in more than just us talking at you. However entertaining we might be, you'll be heading for the hills. So what are we going to talk about? It's no good. I can't sit down and do presentations, I always have to stand up. Feels proper somehow. So this is about our involvement thus far. We're in the second year of both of these projects. First one we're going to talk about is called Refugee, and as it says, it's collecting examples of some best practice across the partners, looking at young refugees' skills and competences, and that includes both formal and informal learning, and you can imagine how difficult that will be, and how that knowledge can be used in guidance and counselling. And the partners are?
Partners are a university in Norway, and one in Spain, France, Germany and Belgium.
And the second one, which is called CMINA, which we'll explain in a minute, is, again as it says, is developing curriculum materials for training and CPD of career guidance professionals. Both students is the aim, and for those that are working in employment services, working with migrant and refugee populations of all ages, so not just young people. And the partners are us, Sweden, Turkey, Italy, Mannheim in Germany, and Lithuania. So we're going to say something about the literature that we looked at in terms of career guidance and working with refugee and migrant populations. And it was very little that we were able to find, with some exceptions. I mean, there was, lovely to see Ruth here, there was some work years ago that Ruth and Charles did. We found also an interesting paper by Jenny Bimrose and Stephen. But really, most of the literature that we used was around education more broadly, rather than specifically career guidance and counselling. And then we're going to talk a bit more about the needs analysis, which was the second part of the CMINA project, which had to, of course, involve various experts that we'll talk about, but importantly a former refugee who is now a counsellor working with refugee and migrant populations in a charity. He's also working with us as a university to develop an undergraduate programme on working title refugee studies. And we're going to illuminate it with Alex's story and build in time for an exercise and some discussion. Hello? Somebody press a button, nothing's happening. Perhaps I'm pressing the wrong, no I'm not. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. It's just my assistant in the spangly tights.
No, I'm not.
Let's press the button then.
Oh, it's not working. It's frozen. It was working earlier.
It was.
Go on, we're not the other way now.
Okay, well, there are some pictures to look at. Well, there would be.
Will it? Oh. Oh,
There we go.
oh.
So this was part of the information. This is about what we do know. And again, this information is the start of both projects. So this one that we're looking at the moment is the Tari refugee camp, being the largest of several large refugee camps in Jordan, with almost 100,000 inhabitants. And the next one, please. Is when it appears, a refugee camp in Kenya, which at the time when we started both of these projects was the world's largest, with almost 500,000 inhabitants. and the Kenyan government wanted it closed by the end of November this year. Moving on. Lebanon, the country hosting the highest number of refugees per capita. Syrian refugees constitute almost 35% of the total population, and the camps are very poorly equipped. Okay, so we move on. So, I mean, this is what we know. We know about the refugee camps. We also know about the images that we all saw in the media and elsewhere about asylum seekers, refugees, etc., who were coming into Europe. But rather than show you those pictures that we're familiar with, we thought we'd let you, fingers crossed, watch this, because I think it's a very powerful way of thinking about what's happening in the EU, and maybe it's a good demonstration. I'll keep talking to this now of the, this concept of the stranger in our midst, and I'm grateful for Anne.
I used to be St Martin, St Martin in the Fields.
Pause it for a sec.
It's the place where the people have spoken perhaps more than most in London, and you'll all have your own memories. CND
Can't stop
marches.
him now.
No, he's off. Still on me. Go on.
Needs to. It will. Here we go. This is Umbria.
Okay. Each year ends in Trafalgar Square, and unforgettably Nelson Mandela arriving after all those years of demonstrations in St Martin against apartheid, and finally he arrived, and he pushed through us all and went into the embassy and then stood up on the balcony and addressed us all and said, "I would like to take you all home in my pocket." Where would you rather be than in Nelson Mandela's pocket? But it's not always been a place of peace and good fortune and good words. And just 600 years ago there was a riot in St Martin in the Fields. And the complaint was about strangers. Strangers in our midst, and the cry was that they should be removed. Usual complaints about strangers, they eat odd food, speak odd languages, take our jobs, take our houses, better send them back wherever they came from. And the authorities sent out to put down the riot, at least according to William Shakespeare, Thomas More, the hero of Man for All Seasons, at this time a youngish lawyer who presented the case for peace by arguing that people should obey the law and stop rioting, and secondly being by Shakespeare with a plea to humanity, which has earned its place in this wonderful book. It does say that the speech is attributed to Shakespeare because he didn't write the whole of the play that it appears in. But there is no doubt he wrote it because, well, when you hear it, you'll know. But you can go and see it. It's in the British Museum. It's the only example of Shakespeare's writing of a script in existence, just one page. And it's this speech. It's symbolic and wonderful for all sorts of reasons. It should be this speech of all, so little known, and so at the heart of Shakespeare's humanity that it should be permanently on display. So the cry is that the strangers should be removed. And Thomas More replies, "Grant them removed, and grant that this your noise hath chid down all the majesty of England." Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, with their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silenced by your brawl, and you in rough of your opinions clothed. What have you got? I'll tell you. You had taught how insolence and strong hands should prevail, how order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reason, and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes feed on one another. Oh, desperate as you are, wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you like rebels lift against the peace, lift up for peace, and your unreverent knees make them your feet, to kneel to be forgiven. You put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses, and me, the majesty of law and lion, to slip him like a hound. Say now, the king, as he is clement, if the offender mourn, should so much come too short of your great trespass, as but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Go you to France, or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain, or Portugal, anywhere that not adheres to England, why you must needs be strangers? Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if the God owned not, nor made not you, nor that the elements were all appropriate to your comfort, but chartered unto them? What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainish inhumanity.
So Anne is now going to follow.
Yes. A small recitation.
And talk a little bit more about the projects before we move on.
While getting that up, I would just say that I think that poem, which I came across really at the very beginning of both of these projects, quite by accident, is really, for me, was very useful because, of course, as good practitioners, we start with ourselves and good reflective practice. And it's important to start by thinking, how might it feel? And how do I feel about what's happening and what's happened to the people that I work with? I was also fortunate enough to visit Lebanon and saw firsthand some of the situations that are there. And it is quite unbelievable, I suppose is the word, and very impactful, and it gave me a very good grounding personally to become engaged with these projects. Then also meeting Alex and hearing his perspective really gives us a good starting place. So, can I do this now? Okay, no, thank you. So, the two projects then, a little bit more detail about those. Refugee is, as it says, really about trying to ensure that young refugees are not neat, and if they are neat, doing something about it. So it is very much, as Hazel said earlier, it's very much about skills, it's very much about measuring skills, and very importantly, particularly the part of it that I'm taking a lead on, is looking at the whole person that arrives in wherever it is they arrive. In this case, where we started off was in Norway. So it's collecting some of the very good practice that takes the young person as a whole, not just as a refugee, but engages with them from where they are and their whole story, so that we can really get a good idea and a good measure even of the skills that they bring with them. Because of course they don't bring their certificates, although some, I did meet some that had. They don't bring necessarily the same language, even if they speak English or Norwegian. So they need a great deal of support to get to help to enable those that are working with them to understand their skills, and also to be able to understand their aspirations. What we found was that the vast majority, certainly in Norway, of young refugees tend to go in the direction of quite level 2, level 3 craft work, because it requires less language and so on. And yet, these young people are actually very able and had been in Syria or other places before they left. So our aim is to develop some really good procedures and methods that build on practice that is going on, particularly in Germany, Sweden and Norway, to work with those young people and work with them as peers so that they are supporting each other to identify what those skills are and to work in a careers counselling context. We've also developed, I say we, I didn't, was one of the other partners in the project, and this thing called Skills Bank, which is a bit OCR, really, sort of in terms of having lots and lots of competences and skills and identifying those, but in a much clearer non-language way, so that there are films that demonstrate floristry and things like that. So it's removing as much of the need for very high level language as much as we possibly can. And really looking at some of the non-formal skills that they've learned. So for example, on their journeys, which are extraordinary journeys, I met people who, and I didn't even know this happened, that didn't come across the Mediterranean in a small boat. They actually walked through Russia and came into Norway from the top end. Many of them, young families, had bought a bicycle somewhere in Russia with the last of their money and used that to transport their small children on. Some of them fell, some of them broke limbs, some of them lost digits because of the cold and so on. And then when they arrived in Norway, the bicycle is destroyed, which is to me very symbolic actually, that they've lost absolutely everything. But they have learned enormous resilience, an enormous capacity to learn and to find, to solve problems and find ways round what to most of us would be an unthinkable situation. So it's some of these informal skills and competences and attitudes and resiliences and character, if I suppose you could call it, that we're also trying to capture in the systems that we're developing. I think I probably just said most of that. There's also a desire to devise this thing, the Refugee Pass, which would be almost like a record of achievement that would bring together skills, competences, and their voluntary work and other things that they're doing in the refugee centres that bring all those things together. And then the ultimate aim is to provide some training so that the young refugees themselves will be enabled to support each other in small groups from the initial refugee and asylum hotels, essentially they are, onto further training when they get their own flats and other places to live. But to put together, re-put together, I suppose, a family based on one or two people that have been trained, and trained in essentially very basic careers counselling skills to understand the needs of their family, the young family that they'll be working with. And a lot of that will be based on the notion of recognising prior learning, of course, and that's one of the systems that we're involved in developing. CMENA, which I'm not sure if either of us really get the acronym here, but basically what it is about developing, rather than services directly for young refugees and asylum seekers or adults that come to that, but to develop training for careers practitioners who are going to be working with them. So when I said earlier that I thought it was really important that we started with ourselves, hence the poem, this is one of the things that we've been really focusing on in this project, to enable practitioners to really look in a critical way at their own attitudes, their own ideas, the things that they find difficult, the things that they find that works, and put that together into a training package so that anybody who's going to be working with refugees has the competences that we have clearly now established are so important for working with this particularly vulnerable group. I should just say, actually, the thing that I think you'll find with the exercise that we're going to do here is that what we found was that some of those attitudes and some of that learning that would need to be done by career counsellors in order to work with this particular group actually is very useful for working with any really vulnerable group, so young people that have been traumatised in other ways. So if people aren't necessarily working with refugees and asylum seekers, you would see a real crossover of skills and exercises and understanding needed to work with other young people that have been traumatised in different ways. So we're putting together as a group a number of modules. We've just written the one that we're responsible for, as well as putting together a whole series of materials to work with alongside the training course. And alongside that, there will also be some online resources to use directly with other counsellors in the context of the training programme. Anything else you want to keep going? Keep going. So I think we've said this really, haven't we? The review of the literature, which we did first of all, really helped us to see what the needs were in the CMENA thing, and some of those were quite surprising. And some of those came from our friend and colleague Alex, who was a refugee from Rwanda, and really gave us a very good insight into some of those needs. So we collected data from refugees themselves, also from people learning to be careers practitioners, also current practitioners, some of whom had experience with working with refugees, some of whom didn't. We talked to lecturers on our programmes, we talked to researchers and academics, and we put together, I think, a pretty comprehensive 360-degree view of what is really required, over and above, of course, what people will need anyway in terms of the skills in order to do career counselling.
Just to explain all these different parts of a project now, people involved in the European projects will know. IO is intellectual outputs, so you have these intellectual outputs. It used to be work packages.
Yes, we're still on work packages in the Refugee, which is quite confusing. But yes, it must be the latitude. So this is a very brief summary, really, of what people said when we were asking them about what they thought they might need if they were to work with refugees and asylum seekers, or if they already were. So counsellors were particularly worried about facts. That doesn't surprise anybody, I'm sure. They wanted to know stuff. So they needed to know routes, progression routes. They needed to understand what qualifications were. They needed to be able to speak many languages, which is quite an ask. But moreover, they wanted to be able to know the practicalities of working with an interpreter, which is clearly very important because it's a very different dynamic. Experienced practitioners said that language actually is only a tool anyway, and that we need to be much more aware of the cultural context that language is being used in, and this is something that Alex said a great deal about. And I'll give some examples if I can later, perhaps not now.
Yeah, I'll read it.
You're going to read those first. Yeah. Some of them are mildly amusing, but actually in the context of it, it's not funny at all because of the complete misunderstanding that language can have if you just translate things. Things like skills, for example, to look at the skills that are needed in one context and be able to transfer them elsewhere. Then the importance of being able to reflect, which is going back to what we were saying earlier, to really be able to reflect on how do I feel about working with this particular group? Are my emotions getting in the way in some ways between myself and the pragmatic steps that we need to go through? And with the best will in the world, are there some real stereotypes going on there of the victim and me being the helper and I'm going to sort it all out for you? And so some of those ideas were really powerful and really do require us to reflect in a very deep way and in a very honest way as to how we feel about working with these groups. Refugees themselves said that there was, and I saw this for myself, that there were often, as I mentioned earlier, some assumptions about ability. Because a lot of things are measured in terms of language, the ability is often assumed to be lower than it could be. Of course, the reverse is also a danger, but it tended to be that refugees were tending to go for the lower skilled things. And when asked, they would say, yes, I'm very happy to do that. Because when anyone's offering any help, if you've been through the sorts of things that they've been through, somebody suggests that, well, how about doing a course in floristry? Absolutely, my favourite ever idea, but probably had no idea what floristry is. or really, and that goes back to the cultural context as well. And refugees also report that some of the things that they really did feel confident about weren't asked. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier on, their ability to be resilient, their ability to solve problems, their ability to find somebody to help them when they couldn't find help directly, their ability to work together as a group to help each other. Those are the things that tended not to be even recognised, that tended to be hard skills, qualifications, and of course these are the things that we are now going to develop and make much more overt in terms of their record of achievement, if you like, or the past. Okay, so this is Alex Chung's book, Not My Worst Day, and I if ever you get to read it, and if you give it back, I don't mind lending these out. The Not My Worst Day is a saying in Alex's original mother tongue, and it's a fable really about an animal going through the jungle and coming across all sorts of beasts that were going to eat it, and the beast would say, "Not today. Today is not your worst day." And it's a saying that got him through an awful lot of horrific situations and trauma. But he would say to himself, "No, today is not my worst day." In other words, I'm not going to give up yet. So that's why he called it that, and it's an extraordinary book. And Hazel's going to read you a couple of...
No, you were going to do something from the book.
I'm going to do something
quotes from the needs analysis,
okay.
just to give you a break.
Okay. So, a couple of things that came out of both getting to know Alex and also working with them and then reading his book were, as I say, some of the slightly amusing things which sometimes you'd have to laugh or you'd cry, and going back to what we were saying earlier on about language, when he first arrived as an asylum seeker in this country, he was asked, and he'd been a cattle herder on the plains of Rwanda as a little boy, and was very, very skilled at, for example, being able to smell one particular kind of snake in the grass that was particularly lethal. He could smell that at about 50 metres, although of course he didn't know it was 50 metres, it was about yay far away or something like that. So this notion of smell, being able to diagnose what was wrong with one particular member of the herd by smelling its dung or its urine, these were absolutely key skills, which of course when you come and someone asks you what are your really important skills that you can do at Dover, they probably didn't think those were particularly useful. And he...
Snakes in the grass.
Well, maybe that's true. But one of the other things was, they said, well, okay, you've been herding cattle, so let's give you a maths test.
That's in here.
Oh, is that in there? Can I not say it?
No.
Okay. Hazel will tell you about the maths test. Okay, so I'll read just a few examples here. One is also relates to language, and some of these cultural, contextual things that we need to think about. So, who am I? He starts with. I hesitate to write even the first line of my story. I would like to begin with my name is so-and-so and I was born in such and such a place in such and such a time. But these three basic things are not known. So you can imagine the questions that come up in Dover, you know, who are you, how old are you, where are you from? The date on my passport is at best an educated guess, and the name on it isn't the one I was given. As for the place, I think I know the name of the village and the area roughly in the country, but the name of the country has changed several times within even the space of my lifetime. My story is one where history, geography and politics combine to complicate what should be the simplest statements about who I am. So some of those absolutely basic things he wasn't able to answer. So they think, well, he must be a bounder and he's dragging us along here. Another excerpt from this, which I thought you might enjoy. He'd been talking about how he would sell chickens, his mother's chickens, in order to pay for his education. He was a very bright little boy and he wanted to go to school. Of course, this didn't stop me from wanting to go to the village school, and I waited impatiently to be old enough to do so. there were no records of a child's date of birth, readiness for school was determined not by asking the age or whether a child could, not by asking the age, but asking whether or not the child could stretch his arm behind his head and touch the opposite ear with his fingers. That's a good entrance test, isn't it? Every day I would try to do this, hoping that my arm had grown long enough. Finally I succeeded, and I took myself, my heart beating fast with excitement, to the school to speak to the teacher and register and demonstrate that I could touch my ear. My disappointment was bitter when he simply told me to go back home. When I asked why, he said, because I should be helping my mother to look after my younger brother. This goes on to explain that eventually he got permission to go to school, and he had to sell a chicken to do this. And he went into the village to sell this chicken just as the militia came into the village. And he was so terrified, not of his own life, but of the life of the chicken, because if he lost the chicken, he would never be able to go to school, so that it was, as far as he was concerned, his life over anyway. So he hid in water, he nearly drowned said chicken, he hid in the woods, he eventually was taken in by somebody who tried to steal his chicken. He then ran back into the militia, who stole him and the chicken. He pretended he needed to go to the toilet, and they said, well, we'll hold the chicken, and he said, no, I'll hold the chicken. So there was a pull over this poor chicken, the state the chicken was in at the end of it, as he went off into the woods to go to the loo, and just ran. And he was shot at, and he saw blood, and he thought, oh, the chicken's dead. Now I'm really in trouble, but it was him, so he was quite happy, reasonably happy that the chicken didn't die. So the end of that little story was that he was able to sell his chicken and start school. That was the beginning of the troubles that happened in his village, which then escalated, and he lost the vast majority of the members of his family. The end of the story is marvellous, because he did then go back, and if you want to have a look at some of the pictures in here, he found his father, who was pretty much the only member of his family left, and his father just wanted to know where the cattle all were, because it was their life, and the cattle were their family. They are their means of living, they are currency, they are absolutely everything, and this man just felt his life was worthless without the cattle, and couldn't understand what Alex was doing in Canterbury, where there were none. Those are some excerpts of Alex's story.
So Alex was one of our participants in the needs analysis, and as I said earlier, as a former refugee from Rwanda, I believe, and then working in Kent in a charity working with migrant, refugee and asylum seekers. So the needs analysis that we all used across the countries was based on a number of headings, and again, some of these stories, as Anne indicated, are kind of amusing, but they're also powerful in terms of our understanding of how different it must be for people arriving in a new country. So on the one of the parts of the needs analysis was on migrant, refugee, asylum seekers' readiness to receive career guidance and counselling. So Alex said, before they have this initial security, it is unlikely they will engage with any discussion about education, training or work, although they may appear to be doing so out of politeness. They are unlikely to challenge and do not know how to ask the relevant questions and what questions they are allowed to ask. The issues of power here, isn't there? There are then issues for them which will be hidden and not presented. And it's a bit like an analogy of going to a doctor and being asked what is wrong and being treated for a minor illness when there is something much more serious going on. The treatment is therefore superficial. The important issue here is, are they ready for the intervention that's being proposed? At what point of readiness is the person for career guidance and counselling? So on asking about previous education, and Anne's touched on this, and experience for the labour market, so part of what career guidance and counselling is about, kind of fitting, in inverted commas, people into both. So in finding out, career guidance counsellors, will need to think about how the questions are framed. The person is likely to come with a different worldview, and meanings are not shared. What does it mean if a person says, I used to be good at maths, but not now? What do we mean by maths? I was taught maths as a former herdsman in Africa. I was asked in the UK, as a maths test, if you have 10 cows and I take away 6, how many would you have? Why would you take away 6 of my cows? I'll be in terrible trouble. I cannot go home without all my cows. Questions must be sensitive to a different worldview and understanding why you need to understand formal subjects. Questions should be open, but more to encourage. Tell me more about, tell me more, and help me to understand, rather than seeking factual answers. Ill thought through questions can make the person more vulnerable. They need to know why you're asking the question and what you're using the information for. They need to know the purpose of the questions. Another area was on understanding systems in a new country. So there's a need for advocacy and some hand-holding as required, though not assumed. For example, the newly arrived person will not understand that if they need a truck to carry out the work that they did previously, they cannot just go out and buy one and start driving. They need to be guided through the relevant systems, which will seem over-complex and be a barrier. And there needs to be constant checking that the service that is being offered at different points in time remains relevant. And finally, on contextual, what he referred to as navigational knowledge. The person needs knowledge of the small things. For example, why do I need to put a notice about a cable being a hazard? Why do I need to be told the water in the hot tap is hot? I have come from a war zone. The person needs to understand the expectations, as there may be no excuse for not understanding. And perhaps, we concluded, the counsellor needs to enter their world and ask, what is strange to you? What do you not understand?
Okay, thank you. Yes. There was an additional bit to that maths bit, because it said if I don't know if any of you know the sorts of cattle we're talking about in the central plains of Africa. I mean, they're enormous. They're not like Frisians. And so, and they said, what would happen if a tiger, if this is somebody from Dover, what would happen if a tiger ate a certain number of them? And it just looked at them and gasped. I mean, there's no way it could happen. How could it? It would take them weeks to get up the leg. You know, there's absolutely no way. So there's those sorts of understandings that were really important. Okay, probably a little bit more of that later. Yeah. We'd now like you to take part in an exercise.